In the world of military aviation, call signs are more than just radio identifiers. They're legends whispered in briefing rooms, stories that separate the living from the dead, and sometimes ghosts from the realm of the impossible. What happens when a call sign carries the weight of a secret so classified that even admirals lose their composure upon hearing it? This is the story of a woman whose silence spoke louder than any words, whose presence in a room could shift the very air, and whose two simple words, Ghost 5, would unlock a mystery that had haunted the highest levels of military command for over a decade. Some stories are buried so deep that only the trembling of a seasoned admiral's hands can reveal their truth. This is one of those stories. Admiral James Harrison had seen everything the military could throw at a man during his 37 years of service. He had commanded aircraft carriers through storms that would terrify seasoned sailors, overseeing classified operations that existed only in the deepest vaults of Pentagon archives, and faced down hostile forces in waters where diplomacy meant nothing and firepower meant everything. But nothing in his distinguished career had prepared him for the moment when a woman in civilian clothes walked into his briefing room and changed everything he thought he knew about the impossible. The morning started like any other at Naval Air Station Oceana. Harrison arrived at his office before dawn, as was his habit, reviewing intelligence reports and operational updates with his usual cup of black coffee. The base was preparing for a routine training exercise involving several squadrons, including some of the Navy's most elite pilots. It was supposed to be a standard day, the kind that filled logbooks with unremarkable entries and sent everyone home to their families by evening. The first sign that something was different came when his aide, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, knocked on his door with an expression Harrison had never seen on her usually composed face. Mitchell had been his right hand for 3 years, handling everything from classified briefings to diplomatic visits with the same unflappable efficiency. Seeing her rattled was like watching a lighthouse suddenly go dark. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tremor, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Harrison looked up from his reports, noting the way Mitchell stood rigidly at attention, her knuckles white as she gripped a manila folder. "What kind of situation, Commander?" "Sir, there's a woman here. She says she needs to speak with you about Operation Desert Echo."
The coffee cup stopped halfway to Harrison's lips.
Operation Desert Echo was a name that should have been buried so deep that even thinking about it required special clearance. It was a mission that officially never happened, involving people who officially never existed, in a place that was officially never occupied by American forces. The fact that someone was walking around his base using that name made his blood run cold. "Who is she?" he asked, setting down his cup with deliberate care. "That's the problem, sir. She won't identify herself. She just walked past security like she owned the place, came straight to headquarters, and asked to speak with you. When they tried to stop her, she mentioned Desert Echo, and suddenly everyone was calling me." Harrison stood up, his mind racing through possibilities. Desert Echo had been a black operation from 12 years ago, so classified that fewer than 20 people in the entire military knew it had ever existed. Those who did know were bound by security oaths that made their marriage vows look casual. For someone to walk onto his base and casually mention it meant either they were incredibly dangerous or incredibly important, possibly both. "Where is she now?" "Conference room C. I posted guards, but sir..." Mitchell hesitated, looking even more uncomfortable. She told them their names, their hometowns, and details about their families that aren't in any public record. They're convinced she's some kind of intelligence operative, but her clearance codes don't match anything in our system. Harrison felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, the kind that came with decisions that could affect national security. He had dealt with spies before, double agents, foreign operatives, and military personnel operating under deep cover. But something about this situation felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Have you run her through facial recognition?" "That's where it gets interesting, sir. The system found her, but the file is classified above my pay grade. Above most people's pay grade, actually. The only thing I could access was a note saying that any inquiries about this individual should be immediately forwarded to you, personally." Harrison walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where FA-18 Super Hornets sat in neat rows, their sleek forms gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, pilots were preparing for what they thought would be a routine day. He envied them their certainty. "All right, Commander, I'll see her. But I want you to initiate Protocol 7. Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. Protocol 7 was reserved for situations involving potential threats to national security, requiring immediate communication with the Pentagon, and the establishment of a secure perimeter around the affected area. It wasn't something they used for ordinary visitors. Sir, are you sure? Protocol 7 will bring a lot of attention, I'm sure. And Commander? Make sure the recording equipment in Conference Room C is operational, but route the feed through the secure server. Whatever happens in there, I want it documented, but I also want it contained. As Mitchell left to make the arrangements, Harrison remained at his window, watching mechanics perform their pre-flight checks on the aircraft below. He thought about Desert Echo, about the mission that had gone so far beyond classified that it existed in a realm where even shadows had security clearances. He thought about the pilots who had flown that mission, the ones who had come back changed, and the one who hadn't come back at all. 20 minutes later, Harrison walked down the corridor toward Conference Room C, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors with military precision. The guards outside the room snapped to attention as he approached, but he could see the tension in their faces, the way they kept glancing at the closed door, as if something inside might burst out at any moment. "Any problems?" he asked the senior guard, Petty Officer Rodriguez. "No, sir, but—" Rodriguez hesitated, clearly struggling with something. "Sir." She knew my daughter's name. She knew that Maria's studying engineering at Virginia Tech, knew about the scholarship she got last month. That information isn't in any file, sir. I never mentioned it to anyone here. Harrison felt his stomach tighten. Intelligence operatives were good at gathering information, but knowing personal details about random security guards suggested resources and capabilities that belonged to very few organizations in the world. Most of those organizations were supposed to be on America's side. "Thank you, Petty Officer. Maintain your posts, but give me some privacy for this conversation." Harrison opened the door and stepped into Conference Room C, a sterile space dominated by a large wooden table and chairs that had seen countless briefings, debriefings, and classified discussions. At the far end of the table sat a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, with short dark hair and the kind of posture that spoke of military training even though she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple black sweater, and boots that looked both practical and expensive. What struck Harrison most was her stillness. She wasn't fidgeting, checking her phone, or showing any of the nervous energy that most people displayed when waiting in a military facility. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, looking at him with eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. "Admiral Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "Thank you for seeing me. I understand you wanted to discuss Operation Desert Echo," Harrison said, remaining standing, using his height and position to maintain a psychological advantage. It was a technique that had served him well in countless negotiations and interrogations. The woman nodded slowly. "Among other things, before we go any further, I need to know who you are and how you came to know about a classified operation."
For a long moment, she said nothing, just studied his face with an intensity that made Harrison feel like she was reading his thoughts.
When she finally spoke, her words were measured and careful. "My name is Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Navy. Service number 1847-9923, 4401. I was reported killed in action 12 years ago during a classified mission in the Persian Gulf region." Harrison felt the world shift slightly on its axis. He knew that service number. He had signed the paperwork declaring its owner dead, had written the classified report that buried the details so deep that even he had tried to forget them. Captain Elena Vasquez had been the pilot of Ghost 5, the aircraft that had vanished during Operation Desert Echo, taking with it secrets that the Navy had spent 12 years trying to forget. "That's impossible," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Captain Vasquez died when her aircraft was shot down over hostile territory. We recovered wreckage. We had confirmation." "You recovered the wreckage of a decoy aircraft that was destroyed by remote detonation to create exactly the evidence you found," she replied calmly. "As for confirmation, well, you had reports from assets in the region who were feeding you exactly the information they were paid to provide." Harrison sank into a chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. If this woman was telling the truth, it meant that everything about Desert Echo was wrong. It meant that one of the Navy's most classified failures was actually something else entirely, and that a pilot they had mourned and buried in an empty coffin had been alive all this time. "Prove it," he said. She reached into her jacket. Slowly, clearly aware that any sudden movements might trigger the security response she seemed to know was watching, and pulled out a small metal object. She slid it across the table toward him. Harrison picked it up and immediately recognized it as a pilot's wings pin, the kind worn on dress uniforms. But this one was special. It was made of titanium instead of the usual materials, with a small inscription on the back that read, "Ghost 5, Elena V." It was the kind of personal touch that pilots sometimes added to their gear, the sort of detail that wouldn't appear in any official record but would be known to the people who mattered. More importantly, Harrison remembered this pin. He had seen Elena Vasquez wearing it during the briefing for Desert Echo, had noticed it because of its unusual material and the way it caught the light. It was the kind of small detail that stuck in memory, the sort of thing that made the official story of her death feel real and final. "Where have you been for 12 years?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's a very long story, Admiral. And it's not one I can tell in a conference room, even a secure one. But I can tell you this. Desert Echo didn't fail. It succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The problem was that the success was so complete, so far beyond what the mission parameters anticipated, that continuing to exist officially became a liability to national security." Harrison stared at the woman across from him, this ghost who had walked back into his life carrying secrets that could reshape everything he thought he knew about one of the most classified operations in naval history. Outside, he could hear the distant roar of jet engines as the training exercise continued, pilots flying their missions in the comfortable certainty that the world made sense and that the dead stayed dead. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come back now?" Elena Vasquez looked toward the window, though the blinds were closed, as if she could see through them to something beyond. "Because 12 years of being dead teaches you things about what matters and what doesn't. And because there's something happening that requires Ghost 5 to officially exist again, if only for a short time." "What kind of something?" She turned back to him, and for the first time since entering the room, Harrison saw emotion flicker across her face. It was fear, the kind of deep, bone-level fear that came from knowing too much about dangers that others couldn't even imagine. "The kind that makes Desert Echo look like a training exercise," she said. "The kind that requires someone who officially doesn't exist to handle a problem that officially can't be happening." Harrison realized that his hands were shaking slightly, something that hadn't happened since his first combat mission nearly 4 decades ago. He was looking at a woman who had been dead for 12 years, who had somehow survived whatever had really happened during Desert Echo, and who was now telling him that something even worse was on the horizon. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the table, where a ghost sat explaining why she needed to return to the world of the living. And Admiral James Harrison, who had thought he had seen everything the military could offer, realized that his education was just beginning. The secure conference room at Naval Air Station Oceana had been transformed into something resembling a war room within an hour of Elena Vasquez's revelation. Admiral Harrison had made the calls that activated protocols most people didn't know existed, bringing together a select group of individuals whose security clearances existed in realms so classified that their names appeared on no organizational charts. The truth about Desert Echo was about to be revealed, and Harrison suspected it would change everything. Present in the room were Admiral Harrison, Elena Vasquez, CIA Deputy Director Marcus Chen, NSA Liaison Dr. Rebecca Foster, and Captain Michael Torres, who had been the operations commander for the original Desert Echo mission 12 years ago. Torres looked like he had seen a ghost, which, in a very real sense, he had. "Before we begin," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in command, "I want everyone to understand that what we discuss here goes beyond top secret. This is compartmentalized information that will not be shared with anyone not present in this room without direct authorization from the Secretary of Defense." Yelena sat at the head of the table, no longer the mysterious visitor who had walked onto the base that morning. In the presence of these senior officials, her military bearing became more pronounced, her posture that of an officer preparing to deliver a mission report that had been 12 years in the making. "Operation Desert Echo," she began, her voice steady and professional, "was not the reconnaissance mission described in the official briefings. The real mission was extraction and elimination. Extraction of a high-value asset who had been providing intelligence on weapons development programs, and elimination of a facility that posed an existential threat to American national security." Captain Torres leaned forward, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "That's not possible. I planned that mission. It was photographic reconnaissance of suspected chemical weapons facilities in international waters. That was the cover story. Even for most of the command structure," Elena replied. "The real mission parameters were known only to a very small circle of people, and I was briefed separately after the official mission briefing. Director Chen spoke for the first time since entering the room. Captain Vasquez, you're describing a scenario that would require authorization from the highest levels of government. There would be records, signatures, A paper trail that couldn't simply disappear. Elena reached into a briefcase that Harrison hadn't noticed she was carrying, a detail that bothered him as it suggested his security people were either compromised or outclassed. From it, she withdrew a thick folder marked with classification stamps that made even these senior officials take notice. The authorization came from a joint task force operating under the designation Project Lazarus, she said, sliding copies of documents across the table. The signatures you'll find include the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Director of Central Intelligence, and someone identified only as Executive Authority 7. Dr. Foster, who had been silent until now, suddenly went very still. Executive Authority 7 was discontinued in 2009. Access to that designation required approval from the National Security Council at the highest levels, which explains why the mission was classified beyond normal parameters. Elena continued. The facility we were targeting wasn't just developing chemical weapons. They were developing something that could have rendered traditional military defense systems obsolete. Harrison studied the documents Elena had provided, noting the official seals and classification markings that would be nearly impossible to forge. More disturbing was the realization that if these documents were authentic, it meant there had been a completely parallel command structure operating at the highest levels of the military, one that he had known nothing about despite his senior position. What kind of weapon? Torres asked, his voice tight with the kind of tension that came from realizing your entire understanding of an event was wrong. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived with a terrible secret for over a decade. They called it Neural Storm. It was a weapon designed to interfere with the electrical systems in the human brain, capable of rendering entire populations incapacitated without permanent physical damage. The applications for both warfare and population control were obvious. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of aircraft operations continuing outside. Each person present was processing the implications of what Elena had just revealed. A weapon that could control minds, developed by a hostile entity, and apparently threatening enough that the United States had been willing to violate international law to stop it. The extraction target, Elena continued, was Dr. Nikolai Petrov, a neuroscientist who had been working on the project under duress. His family was being held to ensure his cooperation, but he had managed to establish contact with American intelligence and was willing to defect if we could guarantee his family's safety. Director Chen was reviewing the documents with the intensity of someone trying to verify information that challenged everything he thought he knew about recent intelligence operations.
There's no record of Dr.
Petrov in our defector files. Because he never made it to American custody, Elena replied. At least, not officially. Captain Torres set down the papers he had been reading, his face pale. Elena, I need you to understand something. According to our records, you died when your aircraft was shot down during the approach to the target. We received confirmation from multiple sources. We held a memorial service. I know. I watched the footage of the service on a secure feed from the medical facility where I was recovering. Elena's voice carried a note of sadness that hadn't been present before. It was necessary for everyone, including you, Mike, to believe I was dead. The use of Torres's first name created a subtle shift in the room's dynamics, a reminder that these people had history together, that the professional relationships predated the current crisis by years. Harrison realized that Elena and Torres must have worked together before, probably on multiple missions, which explained the depth of Torres' shocked reaction to her return from the dead. The mission went sideways about 30 minutes after insertion, Elena continued. The intelligence we had been given was accurate about the facility's location and the presence of Dr. Petrov, but it was incomplete about the security arrangements. What we thought was a research facility was actually a testing ground for Neural Storm, and they had been expecting us. Dr. Foster looked up from the documents she had been studying. How could they have been expecting you? The mission planning for Desert Echo was compartmentalized to prevent exactly that kind of intelligence leak. Because someone on the American side had been feeding them information for months, Elena said. Someone with access to the highest levels of operational planning. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. A mole in the American intelligence community, operating at levels that could compromise the most classified operations, represented a threat that went far beyond a single mission. It suggested a level of penetration that could have compromised dozens of operations and put hundreds of assets at risk. Admiral Harrison felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it felt heavier than usual. Do you know who the mole was? I have suspicions, but no proof. What I do know is that the Neural Storm project wasn't terminated when we destroyed the facility. It was moved, and development continued under different auspices. Elena opened her briefcase again and withdrew what appeared to be a small electronic device, no larger than a smartphone but covered with indicator lights and connections that suggested sophisticated monitoring capabilities. "This is a neural storm detector," she said, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. "I've spent the last 12 years helping to develop countermeasures to the technology we failed to completely eliminate during Desert Echo." Captain Torres stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. "You've been working on this for 12 years? Working for whom?" "For the same people who authorized Desert Echo in the first place. Project Lazarus didn't end when I was declared dead. It went deeper underground, became more classified, and began focusing on the long-term implications of neural storm technology." Director Chen had been making notes throughout the conversation, his expression growing more concerned with each revelation. "Captain Vasquez, are you telling us that there has been a parallel intelligence operation running for 12 years, operating outside normal channels, focused on a threat that we weren't even aware existed?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I'm here because that threat has evolved beyond what the Lazarus team can handle alone. We need official support, but we can't go through normal channels because we still don't know who the mole is." Elena activated the device on the table, and immediately several of the indicator lights began flashing red. The soft beeping it emitted had an ominous quality that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean away from it. "This device is detecting neural storm emissions right now," Elena said calmly. "Low level, probably experimental, but definitely present. Someone is testing neural storm technology within a 50-mile radius of this base." The room erupted in controlled chaos as each official began reaching for secure phones and communication devices. The possibility that an experimental mind control weapon was being tested in the vicinity of one of America's most important naval air stations represented a clear and present danger that required immediate response. "Wait," Admiral Harrison said, his voice cutting through the activity. "Before we alert every agency in the intelligence community, we need to understand what we're dealing with." "Elena, you said the mole is still active?" "Not just active, but likely in a position to monitor our response to this threat. If we follow standard protocols, we'll be telegraphing our moves to the same people who compromised Desert Echo." Dr. Foster had been studying the neural storm detector with the intensity of someone trying to understand a technology that challenged her understanding of what was possible. "How does this weapon work? What are we actually dealing with?" Elena's expression grew grim. "Neural storm uses precisely tuned electromagnetic fields to interfere with the electrical activity in the human brain. At low levels, it can cause confusion, disorientation, and temporary memory loss. At higher levels, it can render people unconscious or cause permanent neurological damage. At maximum intensity, it can kill by disrupting the brain's control of basic life functions." The silence that followed this explanation was profound. Each person in the room was imagining the implications of such a weapon in the wrong hands: the ability to disable military units without destruction of equipment, to control civilian populations without obvious coercion, to eliminate specific individuals without leaving evidence of conventional weapons. "The detector readings we're seeing now suggest someone is conducting low-level testing," Elena continued, "probably trying to calibrate the system for optimal effectiveness while avoiding detection by conventional monitoring equipment." Captain Torres had been studying the mission documents Elena had provided, cross-referencing them with his own memories of Desert Echo planning. "Elena, there's something I need to ask. During the original mission briefing, you asked specific questions about electromagnetic interference protocols. At the time, I thought you were just being thorough, but now you realize I knew more about the real mission than I was supposed to let on," Elena finished. "Yes, I had been briefed on the neural storm threat before the official mission briefing. That's why I asked those questions. I was trying to understand how our aircraft systems would hold up against directed electromagnetic attack. Admiral Harrison was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. A weapon that had been developed 12 years ago, a mission that had been compromised by a still active mole, an agent who had spent over a decade presumed dead while working on countermeasures, and now evidence that the weapon was being tested in the vicinity of a major military installation. "What do you need from us?" he asked Elena. "I need official cover for a mission that can't appear in any official records. I need resources that can't be traced through normal procurement channels. And I need people I can trust who haven't been compromised by 12 years of potential intelligence leaks." Director Chen looked up from the secure message he had been composing on his phone. "You're talking about a black operation that would exist outside the normal command structure. That's not something that can be authorized at this level,
Actually, it can.
Elena said, producing another document from her briefcase. Project Lazarus included provisions for exactly this kind of situation. As long as at least 3 senior officials with appropriate clearances agree that the threat requires immediate action, temporary operational authority can be granted for a period of up to 72 hours. Dr. Foster examined the document Elena had provided, her expression growing more surprised with each paragraph she read. This is extraordinary. It essentially allows for the creation of a completely autonomous operational unit with authority to act without oversight, but only in response to threats specifically related to neural storm technology. The people who authorized Desert Echo 12 years ago understood that neural storm represented a unique threat, Elena explained. They built in safeguards for situations exactly like this. Admiral Harrison looked around the table at the faces of his colleagues, seeing the same mixture of concern and determination that he felt. They were being asked to authorize an operation that would exist outside normal chains of command, led by an agent who had been legally dead for 12 years, in response to a threat that most of the intelligence community didn't know existed. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no going back. We'll be committing to a course of action that could have implications far beyond what we can currently see. Elena met his gaze steadily. Admiral, 12 years ago, I died stopping neural storm the first time. I came back from the dead to stop it again. The question isn't whether the implications are serious, it's whether we're willing to accept the implications of doing nothing. Outside the conference room, the normal operations of Naval Air Station Oceana continued, pilots flying their training missions in aircraft that represented the pinnacle of conventional military technology. But inside the room, a small group of officials were confronting the reality that the future of warfare might involve weapons that could reach directly into the human mind, and that the only person qualified to stop such weapons was a ghost who had chosen to return to the world of the living. The neural storm detector continued its ominous beeping, a constant reminder that somewhere within 50 miles of where they sat, someone was preparing to test the limits of what the human mind could endure. And time was running out. The emergency authorization for Operation Ghost Return came through at 14:30 hours, signed by officials whose names appeared on no public roster and whose authority derived from legislation that existed only in the deepest vaults of national security law. Elena Vasquez, who had been officially dead for 12 years, was now officially alive for exactly 72 hours, with operational authority that superseded normal military command structures and access to resources that could reshape the balance of global power. Within 2 hours of receiving authorization, Elena was standing in Hangar 7 at Naval Air Station Oceana, looking at an aircraft that shouldn't have existed. The Faye. 18G Super Hornet bore no identifying markings except for a small, 5 inches painted in matte black on the nose gear door. To casual observers, it appeared to be a standard electronic warfare variant of the Super Hornet, but Elena could see the modifications that marked it as something far more sophisticated. How long has this been waiting for me? She asked Captain Torres, who was serving as her official liaison for the mission. Since about 6 months after your funeral, Torres replied, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The Lazarus team apparently anticipated that they might need to bring Ghost 5 back into official existence someday. Elena walked around the aircraft, noting the subtle modifications that would be invisible to anyone not familiar with the specific requirements of operations against neural storm technology. The additional shielding around the cockpit, the modified antenna array that could both detect and jam electromagnetic signals in specific frequency ranges, and most importantly, the small device mounted behind the pilot's seat that she recognized as a neural storm countermeasure unit. They've been improving the technology, she observed, running her hand along the aircraft's fuselage. This is at least 3 generations beyond what we had during Desert Echo. The Lazarus team has been busy, admitted Dr. Spin. Foster, who had arrived at the hangar with a team of technicians Elena didn't recognize, 12 years of development, unlimited funding, and access to technology that hasn't been shared with conventional military units. Elena climbed up to the cockpit and settled into the ejection seat, her hands automatically finding the controls and switches that had been modified for operations she had never flown, but had trained for extensively during her years of official non-existence. The aircraft felt familiar in the way that only comes from countless hours of simulation and preparation, but also alien in the sophistication of its systems.
The target? She asked, accepting the mission packet that Torres handed her.
A research facility 37 miles northwest of here, disguised as a telecommunications relay station. Our neural storm detectors indicate that's the source of the test emissions we've been picking up. Elena studied the aerial photographs and intelligence summaries that comprised the mission briefing. The facility appeared innocuous enough, a collection of low buildings surrounded by the kind of antenna arrays that dotted the landscape around any major population center. But the electromagnetic signature analysis told a different story, showing power consumption patterns and signal emissions that were consistent with neural storm testing at significant levels. Estimated personnel: between 15 and 25 individuals, most likely a mix of technicians and security personnel. But Elena, Torres paused, looking uncomfortable. There's something else. Intelligence suggests that Dr. Printibny, Nikolai Petrov, is at this facility. Elena felt her blood run cold. Dr. Petrov had been the extraction target during the original Desert Echo mission, the scientist whose cooperation had been secured through threats against his family. If he was at the current facility, it meant either that his defection had been a deception from the beginning, or that he had been recaptured and forced to continue his work on neural storm technology. Is this a rescue mission or an elimination mission? She asked. Admiral Harrison, who had been observing the mission preparation from the hangar's observation deck, descended to the flight line. That depends on what you find when you get there. If Petrov is there voluntarily, he's a target. If he's there under duress, he's an asset to be recovered. And if I can't determine which, then you make the call. That's why you're Ghost 5. Elena completed her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of missions in aircraft that existed only in classified records. The modified Super Hornet was a masterpiece of engineering, combining stealth technology with electronic warfare capabilities and weapon systems that could engage targets without creating the electromagnetic signatures that conventional missiles left behind. As she prepared for takeoff, Elena's radio crackled with a transmission from the control tower. Ghost 5, you are cleared for takeoff. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. Be advised that you're the only official aircraft in your operational area for the next 4 hours. Ghost 5 rolling, Elena replied, advancing the throttles and feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the Super Hornet gathered speed down the runway. The flight to the target area took 18 minutes, giving Elena time to review the intelligence one final time, and to activate the specialized systems that would protect her from neural storm effects during her approach. The countermeasures built into her aircraft were sophisticated, but they were also untested against the current generation of neural storm technology. At 15 miles from the target, Elena's threat detection systems began registering the electromagnetic signatures characteristic of neural storm emissions. The readings were significantly stronger than what had been detected at the naval base, suggesting that the facility was conducting high-intensity testing or possibly preparing for operational deployment of the weapon. At 10 miles, her radio filled with static as the neural storm emissions began interfering with conventional communication systems. Elena switched to the shielded communication array that connected her directly to the operations center at Oceana, but even that was experiencing interference. At 5 miles, Elena could see the facility through the enhanced optics of her aircraft's targeting system. What intelligence had described as a telecommunications relay station was clearly something much more sophisticated. The antenna arrays were arranged in geometric patterns that had nothing to do with conventional communications, and the power lines feeding the facility were heavy enough to support industrial operations rather than simple signal relay. Ghost 5 to control, she transmitted. Target confirmed. I count 6 buildings, extensive antenna arrays configured for directed electromagnetic transmission, and significant power infrastructure. This is definitely not a telecommunications facility. The response was garbled by static, but Elena could make out enough to understand that she was authorized to proceed with the mission at her discretion. Elena began her approach, staying low to avoid detection by conventional radar while her aircraft's stealth systems worked to minimize her electromagnetic signature. The neural storm emissions were growing stronger as she approached, and she could feel the edge effects even through her aircraft's shielding. A slight disorientation, the beginning of a headache, and a strange sensation as if her thoughts were becoming sluggish. At 2 miles from the facility, Elena's aircraft was detected. Not by radar, which her stealth systems defeated easily, but by the neural storm detection equipment that the facility's operators apparently used to monitor their own emissions. Suddenly, the electromagnetic output from the facility increased dramatically, and Elena felt the full force of a neural storm attack. Even with all her aircraft's countermeasures active, the attack was devastating. Elena's vision blurred, her coordination became unreliable, and for several terrifying seconds, she couldn't remember why she was flying toward the cluster of buildings below her. Only her training and the automated systems built into her aircraft kept her on course, as the neural storm attempted to scramble her brain's electrical activity. But Elena had advantages that the facility's operators couldn't have anticipated. 12 years of working with Lazarus countermeasures had included subjecting herself to low-level neural storm exposure, building up a partial tolerance to the weapon's effects. More importantly, her aircraft systems had been specifically designed to function under neural storm attack, with shielding and automation that could continue the mission even if the pilot became incapacitated. Fighting through the disorientation and confusion caused by the neural storm attack, Elena activated her aircraft's electronic warfare systems. Instead of jamming the facility's emissions, her systems began analyzing and copying them, preparing to turn the facility's own weapon against itself. The buildings below her were connected by underground cables that carried the precise electromagnetic signals needed to coordinate the neural storm system. Elena's aircraft could detect those cables and, more importantly, could inject signals into them that would cause the entire system to overload. Ghost 5 to control, she transmitted, her voice strained from fighting the effects of the neural storm attack. Beginning electronic attack on facility systems. Neural storm effects are significant. If I don't check in within 10 minutes, consider the mission failed and initiate Protocol Lazarus 7. Elena didn't wait for a response. She activated her aircraft's electronic attack systems and watched as they began feeding carefully crafted signals into the facility's neural storm network. Instead of the coherent electromagnetic fields needed to affect human brain activity, the facility's systems would now generate chaotic, destructive interference patterns that would overload their own equipment. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The neural storm emissions that had been hammering Elena's aircraft suddenly became erratic, then ceased entirely as the facility's systems began destroying themselves from within. She could see explosions in several of the buildings below as overloaded equipment caught fire or simply disintegrated under the stress of handling electromagnetic energies they were never designed to process. But Elena's mission wasn't complete. She still needed to determine the status of Dr. Kaba, Petrov, and to gather intelligence on the extent of the neural storm program. She circled the facility, using her aircraft sensors to monitor for survivors and to locate any areas that might contain important information or personnel. Her thermal imaging systems detected a group of people in the largest building, apparently huddled in what looked like a shielded room designed to protect against the facility's own neural storm emissions. Elena made several low passes over the building, trying to determine if the people inside were hostages, technicians, or a mixture of both. On her third pass, she noticed something that made her heart race. One of the thermal signatures was moving in a pattern that she recognized, tapping out Morse code on a wall or floor. The message was simple but unmistakable. Petrov captive family, safe extract. Dr. Petrov was alive, was apparently being held against his will, and was communicating that his family was safe. This changed the mission parameters entirely. Instead of an elimination mission, Elena now had a rescue operation on her hands. Elena landed her aircraft on a straight stretch of highway about half a mile from the facility, using her aircraft's advanced navigation systems to avoid power lines and other obstacles. She secured the aircraft and began the approach to the facility on foot, carrying weapons and equipment that had been specifically designed for operations in neural storm-affected areas. The facility was in chaos. The overloaded neural storm systems had not only destroyed themselves, but had also knocked out most of the conventional electrical systems. Emergency lighting was functioning in some areas, but large sections of the complex were completely dark. Elena made her way to the building where she had detected the thermal signatures, moving carefully through corridors filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burned electronics. The neural storm attack had left several facility personnel unconscious or disoriented, but she detected no organized resistance. She found Dr. Petrov in a reinforced room that appeared to have been designed as a combination laboratory and prison. The scientist was a small, elderly man with grey hair and the kind of deep-set worry lines that came from years of working under threat. When Elena entered the room, his eyes filled with tears of relief. "You are American military?" he asked in accented English. "I'm Ghost 5, Elena replied. "We're getting you out of here." As they made their way back through the facility, Dr. Petrov explained the situation. He had been recaptured 6 months after his attempted defection during Desert Echo and had been forced to continue his work on neural storm technology under threat to his family. The facility Elena had just destroyed was one of 3 such installations, and the technology had advanced far beyond what had existed 12 years earlier. "They can now target specific individuals from distances of up to 50 miles, Petrov told her as they reached her aircraft. "The applications for assassination, crowd control, and battlefield operations are limitless." Elena helped the elderly scientist into her aircraft's rear seat and began the pre-flight sequence for their return to Oceania. As they lifted off from the highway, she could see that fires were spreading through the facility complex, destroying equipment and records that represented 12 years of illegal weapons development. Ghost 5 to control, she transmitted as they climbed away from the target area. Mission successful. Package recovered. Facility destroyed. Neural storm threat neutralized. The response was immediate and filled with relief. Roger, Ghost 5. Outstanding work. You are cleared direct to Oceania. Priority handling on arrival. As they flew back toward the naval base, Dr. Petrov provided Elena with intelligence that would reshape American understanding of the neural storm threat. The technology had been proliferated to at least 6 different organizations, including hostile nation-states and terrorist groups. The mole who had compromised Desert Echo was still active and still feeding information to neural storm developers. And most disturbing of all, there were indications that neural storm technology was being prepared for a large-scale attack on American soil. Elena landed at Oceania as the sun was setting, bringing Dr. Petrov to safety and carrying intelligence that would launch a new phase in the battle against neural storm technology. As she climbed down from her aircraft, she was met by Admiral Harrison and the team of officials who had authorized her mission. "How do you feel about being officially alive again?" Admiral Harrison asked. Elena looked back at her aircraft, at the small 5 inches painted on the nose gear that had identified her as Ghost 5 for more than a decade of classified operations. "Ask me again in 71 hours, she replied. "I have a feeling my time among the living is going to be very busy." Dr. Petrov was immediately taken into protective custody, beginning a debriefing process that would reveal the full scope of the neural storm threat. The intelligence he provided would lead to operations against neural storm facilities in 4 countries and the identification of the mole who had been compromising American operations for over a decade. But Elena's work was far from finished. Ghost 5 had returned from the dead for 72 hours, but the threat she had uncovered would require a lifetime of vigilance to counter. The question was whether she would remain among the living long enough to see those threats eliminated, or whether she would once again have to return to the world of the officially dead to protect the realm of the living. As night fell over Naval Air Station Oceania, Elena Vasquez stood in the operations center, studying intelligence reports and planning missions that would determine whether neural storm technology would reshape the future of human conflict. She had asked for 72 hours to stop a threat that had been developing for 12 years. She now realized that 72 hours might not be nearly enough time. But Ghost 5 had never been deterred by impossible odds. She had died once to protect American national security, and if necessary, she was prepared to die again. The only difference was that this time, when people asked Admiral Harrison about the silent woman who had saved them all, he would know exactly what to tell them about the pilot whose call sign carried the weight of legends. "Ghost 5, he would say, and the trembling in his hands would be from pride rather than fear.